It's 2025 and a new year means brand new opportunities. And for a lot of you out there, I know you've been thinking about one thing over the holidays, and that is starting your own business. But you have so many questions like, how do I get started? How do I come up with a brand? How do I even sell stuff to people? And what am I even going to sell? Now take a deep breath. Shopify has got you. Shopify makes it simple to create your brand, open for business, and get your first sale. And you can get your store up and running easily with thousands of customizable templates. You don't have to be a coding nerd or a design geek to get this done. All you need to do is drag and drop. Shopify also helps with the details like shipping, taxes, and payments from one single dashboard, so you can focus on the important stuff, like growing your business. Established in 2025 has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/truecrime, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/truecrime to start selling with Shopify today. Shopify.com/truecrime.
I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. Welcome back to the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. I'm your host, Alice, and I'm joined, as always, by my learned co-host, Brett.
Hello, Alice. It's always such an honor to speak to you, especially in this time when we have not gotten to talk to each other very much at all. So happy.
Well, yes. So those of you who may not have seen all the tweets and posts or whatnot, I finally had my baby. But of course, those of you who have kids know that the newborn haze is real. And so Brett and I have tried to record for like at least the last 2 weeks, I would say, but I am always the one who has thwarted us. Not me, maybe the baby, but thanks for holding down the fort, Brett, and thanks for all of you for your well wishes. But you know what is really great about having a newborn? I'm literally awake just about every hour of the day now, which means I read all the news articles as they come out. And boy, a lot has come out recently in the Idaho murders case, and a lot that has gotten a lot of people up in frenzies. And the reason I called you, my learned co-host, Brett, is I think one of the key things about being an independent thinker and being a learned person is not to let the noise around you, especially things like clickbait, distract you from what is actually the truth. And I say that because a lot of these articles about the Idaho case are meant to be clickbait, and they're meant to get people in a tizzy. And we'll talk about two specific developments in that case and why they're really nothing burgers. And we'll explain them, what they mean to you, and why they shouldn't be this like case-breaking sorts of news that the media is trying to do. In all honesty, any sort of news in hot cases like the Idaho murder case is going to generate press. And you know what? Press really depends on clicks, and they have to, in essence, spin these developments, even when they're non-developments, to make you want to read them. Hence the kind of drumming up anxiety about a case that I think is really unfounded.
I think anxiety is a perfect word. Fear sells. It always has. People know that, whether it's the yellow journalism of the late 1800s or the clickbait of today. What gets people to click is some shocking headline. And look, there's a lot of money in true crime. People have figured that out, but it's only if you get a lot of clicks. And I think a lot of people have realized that if they can have a lot of breathless discussions about, is the case falling apart in Idaho, they're going to get a lot of people talking and listening and sharing and doing everything else. And Alice and I, poor business people that we are, tend to, instead of doing that, to pour cold water on things. And we're going to be pouring some cold water today. And let me say, not everybody is corrupt. It's easy to be cynical when you see this stuff. You know, there are people on Twitter who claim to have been, and in fact were, former prosecutors, former law enforcement, who say really dumb things, and that always irritates me. But a lot of people just don't know, and they're reacting, and we try and educate people as well as we can. So yeah, we're going to talk about these two things, and in particular, and I'm sure there'll be more things that will develop over time. There have been sort of two developments that have stirred a lot of conversation. One of them is a filing by the prosecution of some Brady/Giglio information. And the second thing is some information. We're learning more about the DNA on the knife sheath and how it was found and developed, which was obviously used later on to tie Brian Koberger to the murder. So we'll start with Brady Giglio. In a lot of ways, it normally is very boring, but people have tried to make this very exciting.
And let's also talk about how they're not the same thing, right? We've talked about Brady before, and Brady does not implicate Giglio, and Giglio does not implicate Brady per se. And so that's the first thing to know, that those are two different legal principles developed under Supreme Court precedents.
Right. And Brady basically said, and most of you know this, hey, prosecution, if you've got some evidence that you think might be exculpatory, you can't hide it. You have to share it with the defense. And if you try and hide it and it turns out to be material and it becomes really important, then that can actually lead to a conviction being overturned. So let me just say the first thing, when this came out and it was titled Brady Giglio, you had a bunch of people freaking out because in their mind, when they see Brady, they think, oh no, that means the case is going to be dismissed. No, when you are giving someone Brady material before the trial, that's you doing what you're supposed to do. So
that's the category. So a Brady information is just that, something that's exculpatory. Violation of Brady is what you have to worry about. So make sure you know how to use those terms.
Exactly. And in this case, like Alice said, it's a Brady/Giglio thing. So Brady comes out first. It says, hey, if you have exculpatory information that's material, you got to turn it over. Well, later on, this case called Giglio came out. And the question was tied to Brady and sort of is a follow-up to Brady in that it comes from a similar principle. Essentially, you're the prosecution. You're putting on witnesses who are law enforcement, who are people you know a lot about. And you might know things that the defense can't know. And those things might go to credibility. And that includes things like investigations into that officer. Imagine, for instance, that you have an officer who pulls someone over. We'll do the simplest possible case. Pulls somebody over and says they smelled alcohol in their breath, so they're going to charge them with a DUI. Well, their testimony, imagine there's no testing, no field sobriety. That all gets declined by the person driving. Well, then the case is going to come down to the testimony of the officer. Did he actually smell alcohol? Did he actually see them swerving? All the things that go into a DUI conviction. Well, imagine that, say on 4 separate occasions, a court had found that that officer had lied on the stand about these kind of things. In cases involving DUIs, he had said he smelled alcohol when he didn't. Very, very rare that you would have something this extreme, but imagine you had that. And imagine the prosecution had that information. Well, Giglio said, hey, when you have information that you could use to challenge testimony of an officer, you need to turn that over to the defense so that they can use it to impeach their testimony if they want to. So they can say to the officer, isn't it true that on 3 separate occasions you've been found to have lied about whether or not someone had alcohol in their breath? You can imagine how a fact finder who hears that testimony, that could make them doubt the testimony of the officer they've heard up to that point, and that could be something that's important for deciding whether or not that officer is credible and whether or not to credit that officer's testimony. That's sort of like an extreme Giglio situation, but that's what it says. If you have that kind of information, you need to provide it to the defense.
And an important thing to note here is that Giglio information is just that. Now, it doesn't automatically disqualify the testifier, the police officer. It doesn't automatically mean that the case somehow has a defect in it now as well, because there could be many instances of Giglio information that are not as extreme and blatant, really, as the one that Brett just said. Really, it's any investigation. And it doesn't have to relate to something like testifying about DUI, something so on point, right? It could be any sort of untruthfulness. And you can imagine, especially in this day and age, with a lot of people questioning police officers' motives, police officers' investigations, anyone really can lodge a complaint. Anyone like in the citizenry can lodge a complaint about a police officer. And if it raises, flags, they certainly should be investigated. But you can imagine that when the inputs could be anyone, really, it doesn't just have to be a judge. It could be any complaint lodged against this officer that could ultimately lead to a finding of untruthfulness. That kind of opens up the world of the universe of potential Giglio information. But again, even if there is a finding, that doesn't automatically disqualify them. Now, you as the prosecutor, you have to think very seriously about your case if it's a DUI case and you have this situation that Brett just laid out where you're, say, only officer on the scene, your main witness, your main witness at trial for a DUI case is this person who has 3 findings of lying about DUI specifically. You might think twice about bringing the case, and you may voluntarily seek to dismiss the case because you recognize how weak your case may be now that you have this piece of Giglio information. But the Giglio finding or the Giglio information in and of itself does not lead to any foregone conclusion.
And really strong Giglio information can end an officer's career. If you actually had an officer who had been found to have lied on the stand 3 times, even once, about something like that, they're probably not going to be prosecuting cases. They're not going to have that job anymore because now they really can't testify. So usually it's not something like that. And like Alice said, this is a very broad category of what could be Giglio. And that's important. We're going to talk about that more in a second. But think about it. Officers have complaints against them all the time. Most of them are unfounded. If officers are involved in a high stakes case, maybe they're accused of something by a defense attorney. That's a potential. Prior acts that are unrelated to your job as a police officer could be Giglio. One that you see, because basically when you're a prosecutor, you're constantly having these conversations with people who are going to testify about potential Giglio information. And you'll hear things like, when I was 16, I got into a fight at a concert. Okay, thank you for letting me know that. That's not going to be Giglio. We're not going to have to worry about that. Number 1, it's really old. Number 2, it doesn't go to your credibility. So it's not even going to be something you have to worry about. What you might see more often, though, are little things like you claimed overtime. You claimed 10 hours of overtime. You really only worked 8. You got dinged by your department for the extra 2 hours and you had to pay the money back. That's the kind of thing that might go to your credibility, and so you need to talk about that. Claims of dishonesty in divorce proceedings. You can imagine that sort of stuff comes up all the time. And generally speaking, when this happens, number 1, the only requirement is you turn it over to the defense, and maybe eventually the defense will be able to use it to challenge your testimony in court. A really famous example of this might be the Mark Furman instance in the O.J. Simpson case. So O.J. Simpson, one of the claims was that he had been framed, and he had been framed because of his race, that this was a racially motivated thing. Mark Furman was one of the main officers on the case, and he had some tapes where he had used some language, racist language, and that eventually came out in the trial, and the defense was allowed to present that to the jury to say, hey, look, this guy has evidence of racial bias in his history. You shouldn't trust what he's telling you about his investigation of O.J. Simpson. That's sort of a famous example of it. A lot of times what happens is you find out this information, and in order to be safe, you go ahead and give it to the defense. But you don't want that information getting out beyond the defense, because just because you have some information that might be Giglio doesn't mean it's actually Giglio, and doesn't mean it's actually relevant to the case. So it may not be something that ever comes in to the trial. So you want to protect your officer. So you do things like what we've seen in this case. You file something where you let the court know, hey, we're providing this information under seal, so it's not public. We would like you to order the defense attorney not to disclose it, and then later on we'll argue about whether or not it's relevant. So you might have a situation where you don't want the defense attorney just to pull this out on the fly in court. You don't want to not turn it over because you would rather have a ruling by the court that it's not Giglio. So you go ahead and provide it. You provide it under seal, and then the court will deal with it eventually. And it only comes up anyway if you have that person testify. So people saw this and they freaked out because, number 1, they assumed this was the worst possible Giglio. This must be an officer who has some sort of internal affairs investigation for being entirely corrupt, and so this is going to ruin the whole case. Maybe. I mean, it's possible it could be something like that, but probably not, number 1. Number 2, even if it was, it's still just a credibility thing. The case doesn't go away. The evidence still comes in. It's just something, if that person testifies, the defense attorney can use to undermine their credibility. And number 3, much more likely is that this is just sort of the thing that always happens in every case. There's some sort of information which may or may not be Giglio, and the prosecution is doing exactly what they should do, which is provide it in a timely manner to the defense and the court so that this can be ruled on at some point. And in some future time, this may just be nixed entirely. The court may say, not really Giglio, or it may say, not relevant enough, it's old, or it doesn't really go to credibility, any sort of things they could say. Or the court could say, yes, defense, you could use that if that person testifies. So it really is, especially right now, knowing what we know now, a complete nothing burger, not that significant at all.
Yeah, Brett, you've said some really, really important things I want to make sure that everyone caught. The first thing is that there's just such a range of Giglio information. And because a violation of Giglio is so much worse often than what the Giglio actually is, if it's even Giglio, you always want to err on the side of overproduction rather than underproduction. So Giglio and Brady violations are potentially case-ending violations that the prosecutor never wants to toe even close to the line. That's why we've talked about this before. Brett and I tend to practice more open records. We want to turn over much more than we think the law even requires so that we never get close to the line of being accused of withholding relevant information. And so same with Giglio. If there is even a potential that this officer won't testify, because remember how big this investigation was? Multiple jurisdictions were investigating. The feds, state and local, so many different law enforcement bodies were part of this investigation. I can't even imagine how many potential officers they can put on the stand. If this particular person's Giglio information is bad enough, they never have to take the stand in this type of a case, because I bet there are probably at least a dozen other officers in similarly situated positions where they can testify about the investigation. Because remember, the police officer gets to testify about what they learn in the investigation, even if it's a lot more broad than, say, a fact witness who has to see everything firsthand. And so that's number one, is they'd have to turn it over even if that officer were not going to testify. And if it's bad enough, it will never come up because they may not have that officer testify at all. And second, I think it's super important what Brett just said. You file it under seal because these are real people behind these names, right? This is a real officer. Everyone knows how much press the Idaho murders has gotten. You can better believe it. If there was some information that were just labeled Giglio or potential Giglio tied to an officer's name, that officer would probably be just harassed beyond belief online, on Reddit, on podcasts, on the news, and it may not even be Giglio information. And so there's just a lot of things at play here, and the prosecution may be saying something as simple to the court as, hey, this case is very important. We're not going to get anywhere close to having anyone be able to allege that we violated Giglio or Brady. And so we're providing this under seal. And again, like Brett said, we'll argue it with all of our legal and factual arguments at a later time, and the court makes a ruling, and we're bound by that ruling later on. But we want to be as forward with all of our information as possible and as timely as well. And frankly, I will say, this is not best practices, but it's just reality. Oftentimes, Giglio information comes out right before someone's about to testify. And why is that? Because you finally sit down with that officer, especially if it's a large case with lots of officers. You finally sit down with them to prep. And when you prep, you go over a Giglio question to see if there's any Giglio information. Of course, best practices, you have all of this information at the forefront, but sometimes something develops from the time that you started the case to the time that person will testify. Sometimes there's just so many people you never thought this particular officer would testify, so you never got around to that particular officer for their questionnaire, or a number of other things may happen. But you better believe it. Every prosecutor who's, following the rules, when they prep their officer to take the stand for whatever type of hearing, they're going to go through the Giglio questions. And the fact that it's coming out now before, I don't think there's any substantive hearing on the books, right, Brett? It just means that they're doing their due diligence here, and they really are trying to be as timely as possible with the information as soon as they find it out.
Yeah, somebody, when one of these clickbait headlines, somebody said this was unforced error by the prosecution. No, it wasn't. It was not an unforced error. It's them doing exactly what they're supposed to do. As Alice said, Giglio and Brady are only deadly if you don't turn them over. If you don't turn them over, your entire conviction can be undone and you have to do it again. If you turn them over, you just deal with them at trial. Even if it comes in, even if it's relevant, you just deal with it at trial. It's not that big deal.
It's just bad facts.
Yeah, it's just bad facts.
Right? So Giglio and Brady, another word for them are bad facts. Every case has bad facts for both sides. Facts that are good for you, facts that are bad for you. But the violation in and of itself is not a bad fact. That's a case-ending decision. And that's why they are doing exactly what they're doing here. No unforced error. It would be an unforced error if they decided to play the judge and decide, this doesn't really seem like Giglio. I'm not going to turn it over now. And then sometime post-trial, this information is discovered, or at trial it's discovered, then we have a violation. Then there's an investigation into when you found out about this information, when you decided not to turn it over, and the effect it would have on the case. So, there's a lot of nuance there.
I guess the defense attorney can pound the table about Officer Jones' incorrect entry of his time when he's trying to explain all the cell phone evidence and the DNA evidence against Kohberger. Okay. Good luck. Good luck, my friend. I don't know. It's just such a silly thing, but of course, people made a big deal out of it. And the other thing they've made a big deal out of is the DNA in a couple ways. The first one I just want to deal with quickly and be done with. People who've never read a search warrant before did not understand why at the end of one of the search warrants, the police officer, there's actually an addendum to the search warrant, said, hey, we've got some DNA evidence. I'm sharing this with you because it's my duty to provide any potentially exculpatory evidence. We do not believe this is exculpatory, and we actually don't even think you should consider this for the basis of probable cause because we think we have plenty anyway, but we're just sharing this with you to be forthright. And people were like, how could the DNA be exculpatory? I don't understand. Guys, so in search warrants, once again, when you're being fulsome, you have a responsibility to include all information that's relevant to the search, including information that might be exculpatory. So if you have a CI, for instance, who's saying, I saw the drugs and the guns in the house, but you know that CI has been unreliable on another occasion, you would be required to put that in the affidavit because search warrants are not just rubber stamp things. The judge is supposed to look at that affidavit, consider the facts, and decide whether or not you've met the probable cause standard. And something that's potentially exculpatory, something that says, well, we think there's evidence there, but maybe there's not, is something the magistrate judge should consider.
And another really important thing, other than that search warrants are not rubber stamped by the court, is it's not adversarial, right? They're filed under seal, and they're filed without the benefit of an opposing party being able to raise things like exculpatory information. So that's why you're required to bring up the exculpatory information in a search warrant, because it's not an adversarial process per se. But at trial, you don't have to bring up, the prosecution doesn't have to bring up the exculpatory information as long as they've turned the information over. And you're allowed to do that because at trial, of course, it is an adversarial process, and there is the other side who has that information, and it's up to them to bring it up.
And if you don't do that, if you don't include that information, you can have something called a Franks hearing, where basically the defense will say, hey, they had this information, they didn't include it in the affidavit, and if they had of, this would not have met the probable cause standard, and that's a problem. And so that's why they did this. And the wording is weird if you're not a lawyer because you don't really understand what he's saying. He's essentially saying, look, we got some more evidence. We don't think it's exculpatory. We actually think it's inculpatory, but we're providing it to you anyway, just so you have it. Oh, and by the way, even if you think it's inculpatory, we think everything is so strong that we've already told you. We don't even want you to consider this just in case for some reason this gets thrown out later. So imagine, for instance, that later on the DNA evidence becomes invalid. Well, basically what the police officer is saying doesn't even matter for our search warrant because we had enough probable cause anyway.
Or imagine this, the DNA, they didn't have the information then, but the DNA comes back with other DNA or some sort of thing that doesn't directly point to Brian Kohberger. They're saying it doesn't matter. For probable cause purposes, we have enough here for that. But if they don't put that line in there, it could become the basis of throwing out the search warrant later on.
Or it could just become the basis for like a useless argument you don't even want to have. So it's also just preventing the defense from making some sort of claim later on. Oh, well, now we need to have a suppression hearing because we got to figure out whether or not the affidavit was fulsome enough. And that's going to waste our lawyer's time. It's going to waste the judge's time, could delay the trial. Really, it's just sort of a boilerplate you use to cover yourself. So that was no big deal. The other thing that's no big deal is there's been some reporting, which may or may not be true. I mean, who even knows, that the Idaho State Police, the lab when they looked at it, they couldn't really get any usable DNA off of the knife sheath. And we've talked about this before. Collecting DNA is not always easy, and different people can find different things. And really sophisticated labs have really sophisticated ways of finding things. If you go to our other podcast, we had an interview with Othram Labs and learned a lot about their system for finding DNA and how they've been able to find DNA when other labs could not. Well, it seems as though, at least according to this reporting, that this knife sheath went to the state lab. They didn't find anything. They then sent it and probably some other items to a private lab. Some people have speculated it was Othram, but I don't think anything's been confirmed, including who it was. That lab was then able to find some DNA. And sure enough, it matches Brian Koberger. And is this a problem? The short answer is no, it's not a problem at all. You could imagine a defense attorney asking a question about it, like, well, why were you able to find it, but they couldn't? But if you have some really awesome witness like Kristen Middleman, you guys all heard her talk on our podcast, she can explain exactly how their process works. And she's going to be able to explain how they were able to find the DNA that maybe another lab missed. The only thing that matters is chain of custody. And the chain of custody process will be exactly the same for a private lab as it would be for the state lab. There's a lot of paperwork you have to fill out. You have to seal some things. You have to make sure everything goes to the other lab in a sealed state so it's not contaminated. But presumably, you're going to have all that at any professional lab anyway. So this is another thing that will turn out to be not a big deal down the line.
Right. And, there's nothing that says that all the investigation has to be done only by the resources of that investigating body. In fact, we contract out all the time to private parties who have the expertise, literally experts, right? We have financial experts, drug experts, so on and so forth, who come and give their expert opinions about different parts of a case. A DNA lab who's an expert on getting DNA information off the smallest minutia of DNA is a type of expertise as well, as long as you can show that chain of custody. And the important part here is the defense will know all of this. They will get that first state report that says that no usable DNA or no identifiable record was made from that DNA. And then they'll get the third party or the private party report that says, no, we were able to find that it matches the suspect here. They'll get both of those. And like Brett said, a good defense attorney will make hay about that. You're motivated by money or whatever. They can do all the things that they get to do. But the fact that the DNA testing came from a private lab is completely fine. In fact, most investigative bodies have some sort of fund for this type of work because we don't have all of the resources, not all of the ballistics. We have a lot of it, not all of the drug testing, not all of X, Y, and Z, because sometimes it doesn't make sense to drop all of your money on, say, a type of ballistic testing machine that you only need one out of, however many thousands of cases. That's not a great use of your resource. But if there were a private company who contracted out their services, that could be a much more cost-effective method of testing for say, a police force. So don't be thrown off by that at all. And you've all probably seen lots of instances where the private sector has weighed in on criminal cases as experts or for their services, and they come testify.
Yeah, there's nothing magical about the state lab. It's not as if there's no requirement that you have a state lab at all. You could just contract all of this out if you wanted to. And you could imagine circumstances in which you'd want to do that. Like Alice said, there are certain highly specialized techniques that it's just not cost effective for you to have at a state lab where you're not going to be doing this kind of analysis very often. And if you don't do that kind of analysis, you're not necessarily going to have the expertise to find what you need to find. And some defense attorney is going to attack this, and it's going to blow up in their face, because what's going to happen is the expert from the private lab, whoever it is going to school them on why their technique is so good and so much better than what was used at the other place. And the jury's going to be like, man, those people really know what they're talking about. I need to believe those guys. And it's going to end up being more powerful for the state, even though the defense may try and make something out of it. Some people pointed out that, I think it was the probable cause affidavit said that the DNA came from, didn't say I don't remember exactly what it said, but essentially it said something like a state lab. And they were like, well, if it didn't come from the state lab, it came from the private lab, does that mean the whole thing falls down? And we've said this before. The law is not a gotcha. Even if there are mistakes in the affidavit, they have to be material. That is not a material mistake. It doesn't actually matter, number one. Number two, even if it did matter, even if it was material, all you do then is you take that portion out and you say, without this portion, does it still have probable cause? The answer is yes, it does. So it's just not going to be an issue. I mean, basically, I think the takeaway from this, there's some interesting things, and we've talked about some interesting things today, and hopefully you've learned some things about legal areas that are, hopefully interesting to some of you and not just boring because they're so nerdy. But most of what you see happening in these early stages, moving towards trial, is going to be, number one, really technical, and number two, a lot of it's boilerplate. It's just what you do. You're filing things you have to file. You're making arguments you have to make. You're providing discovery you have to provide. And really, it's not going to be a big deal at all. So if you're obsessed with this case and you just want to watch everything, there will be plenty of people peddling a lot of BS between now and the trial or the plea agreement, but it's going to be just that. We promise you, if something really material happens that's going to interfere with this case, we will let you know. But this stuff is just ticky-tack stuff that, number one, isn't necessarily even bad, and number two, even if it is, isn't that bad.
Thank you, learned co-host. But, and don't feel bad if you were among the people who got, anxious about the case and seeing these headlines. It's very misleading. And also, if you didn't understand how sealed filings or how the use of experts and private, experts works, there's no reason you would know. And that's why we're here. And that's why we really appreciate you guys bringing these questions to us so that we can explain it to you on Legal Briefs. Because our whole point is trying to make you educated about your justice system so that when these things come up again in the future, you'll be able to spot the things that are actual issues and the ones that are not, and not just rely on how the media portrays it to you.
Exactly.
Wow. This has been fascinating, Brett, as always. And if you have more questions about, the use of Giglio, Brady, private labs, that sort of thing, we're happy to answer. But I think this is pretty self-explanatory. And hopefully, if anyone around you is anxious about these articles coming out, point them to this episode and it should provide a good amount of answers. With that said, Brett, I have to give a really quick shout out because we are able to record this. Look how efficient we are when we know that a baby's about to start crying in 5 minutes. We're like, get to work. Look how much law we can get out there, Brett.
Exactly.
But I could not be recording this episode right now because my baby's still very young and very attached to me. If it weren't for my incredible nanny, we call her Miss Chris, holding my baby right now. So she literally has made my life go round in this postpartum phase. So this episode's dedicated to her. With that said, Brett, do you have anything else you'd like to add before we sign off?
Just thank you to Miss Chris.
We thank her all the time. Well, thank you guys so much. Keep these questions coming. It's so good to be back recording with you, Brett. I've missed you a lot.
I've missed you too, Alice. I'm glad to hear your voice.
Indeed. Well, until next time, y'all, I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs.
Okay,
Let me see my sound. Maybe a little louder. Ah, there we go. Oh, my goodness, I heard it.
Do what you need to do. You got a baby sitting on you, so if it's not perfect, that's fine.
Are you judging me?
You see, I'm always right up on the mic. I feel like you're always a little further away.
I know. There is literally a baby here. Is
I
that
need to
better?
get you. Maybe I'll get you a swing thing where you can pull it down.
You don't
to
have a
instead
swing
of a
thing though, right?
No, but I don't need one.
I clearly have problems. No. I can hear myself, and this
But see, if I
sounds
get
great.
a swing thing, you could just
Well,
pull it right up to you like a real professional.
I don't feel like I